So here I just want to talk about some very general points that are things that are coming out of our work in the country in regards to some of these general things. And one of them is the idea of, in regards to that unity and diversity, one of the things I personally think would be something that we could debate and refine is the idea of how do we create strength in the uniqueness of each country. And I'll give one example that in regards to what would make most meaning for Uganda, for YSB's role, is that as part of the realization of the results of our work, there is an element I personally call last mile impact. And that what we are doing is raising or increasing incomes of these disadvantaged segments like smallholder farmers. But there is a last mile element that is lacking, and that is how does that increased income get converted to improved livelihoods? Because usually there is a misconception, or what they call a misassumption, that an increased income automatically translates into an improved livelihood, right? And from what I'm seeing up close, it's not necessarily the case in most of the examples, or most of the cases. And I'll tell you that why that is the case is that a lot of these segments that are disadvantaged because they are typically in very rural and remote areas. They are typically of people who have not had the privilege of having a formal education. So what is considered very basic to many of us because of that advantage that we have, our formal education, the exposure you have, and the access to many things modern. Many of these guys that get this improved income don't even necessarily have the full understanding of the options they have to convert that newfound income into an improved livelihood. Even in some other worst cases is that some of them that have not had the privilege of getting to understand the basics, like basic primary health care basics, like boil your drinking water, wash your hands before you eat, make sure you are using a pit latrine, in the rural areas and things like that. You improving his income from $1 to $1 million will not make him know those things. So even when they are now cash rich, they still remain idea and exposure poor. And so there's that need for that last mile impact to help them convert that money into realizing their full potential. In fact, I use another analogy where I come from, in my country. There's a saying that goes that the heart cannot desire what the eyes have not seen. So if I have ever seen a car in my life because of where I live, even when I can afford a car, I will never buy a car because I don't know it exists, I don't know its importance, I don't know its goodness. So giving me more money will not make me understand that getting a car, for example, will improve my life in many ways, including transporting my merchandise to the market, all these things. Just to give a graphic example of what it really means to do that last mile impact, the knowledge following the money to convert that to maximum results. The other thing I'll talk about is, again, also very unique in my country, as in perhaps also many African countries. There is also what is called the African tax. And the African tax is a phenomenon where you have a situation where if you are a successful person from a community or a family, you usually have the burden of the entire extended family on your shoulders. And that does bog you down, especially when you're starting out. And so there is need for developing some kind of mentoring and training about how to deal with those kinds of problems, especially when you are a borrower from an organization like ours, where you need to plant that seed to a point where it can then multiply into many more seeds upon the harvest. And so that harvest that you can begin now paying your African tax rather than paying it on the seed, for example. And that is, in some instances, driving some areas of default. A third example I want to give also is that, as is commonly known in many of the portfolio discussions we are having at the IC level, there is always the concern of key man risk in many of our clients. And that's also part of the society structure, especially on the continent. And that we shall never run away from. It becomes very academic, there's not much you can do about it because you're a founder, he's everything, he knows everything, institutional memory is all in him. And so, I mean, with his absence or the demise, not much can happen. And not many entities actually will live to see their next month in case of that event. And so one of the things that breeds is the challenge I call the leadership by right versus leadership by competence. Because with many of these organizations we fund, they have the situation where you have the founder being the CEO at the same time. And so when they begin as small entities, that founder is a CEO by right because they founded these things, they begin hiring and growing this company, and then they reach their point of incompetence where this thing grows so big that their leadership by right is no longer relevant because now they need to have leadership by competence, which they don't have. And that's an area where also as YSP, as thought leaders, as pioneers in this industry, we need to realize that problem and do something about it, practically something about it. How do we create some curriculums, some training, some mentorings to move these CEOs from being CEOs by right because of their founding status to CEOs by competence, where they need to grow into that position and be able to manage them beyond their existence. And then my last point of submission, I want to talk about an earlier discussion we had about the sustainability discussion. In my previous organization, we used to call it the operating self-sufficiency, OSS. And I'll give you my very honest views because one, I want to say that I do not think that there is any impact fund on the globe that has since become self-sustaining. I don't think it is there. And I don't think it will be there in the near term. And the real reason why is that one of the things that will make it extremely difficult to become self-sustaining in the real sense of it, like the banks are, is that we're operating in a space that is unattractive to commercial lenders in the first place. And that's why we exist, because if it wasn't, then we would have no reason to be here. And because of that, we are making the philosophical argument that we have returns in three forms for the work we do. The first return is that we are having an economic return. That's the interest that we charge. But it is below market rate because there are two other returns that counter-compensate for that being below market rate. One is the social impact return, the other is the environmental responsibility return. And so for us to get into to be under so much pressure about being self-sustaining on the sole economic number becomes very difficult because then we can't be as competitive as the banks. One, because we are not lending at their rates. Number two, we are not lending as safely as they do because India was a good example where they said all their loans are unsecured. That means if anything went south, you don't have any downside protection in the first place. And give another example, when Colombia said that they need $600,000 of interest income a year to become self-sustaining, the calculations show that 12%, they'll need about $5 million to deploy to earn that 600,000. But it also means that because you are running a very tight ship, you have no room for error. So on $5 million, if $500,000 went into default, you are obviously not going to self-sustain. And it will have to go into default at one point because you are already in a very risky sector. And unlike a bank, you don't have the luxury of deploying funds into things like securities and government securities and bonds, into other non-impact sectors that the banks have. You don't have, the collateral you talked about. So you cannot think that you will be self-sustaining economically in a field that is unattractive and also in a field where you have zero tolerance for default. If I'll give an example, when I joined Root Capital about 14 years ago, they had a flagship mantra that said, we have a 99% repayment rate. And the first thing I told them when I joined, I said, this has to be set aside because it is not possible to sustain it. And it's only 99% because you're still very small. I was their first African staff. They were still getting their footing on the continent. They had a portfolio that was very tiny. So you could afford to say 99%. But the moment you begin growing, it only takes one of your big loans to go bad, and that 99% becomes 86, 88%. So I think for me, what I'm saying is that we need to be a little more creative in making the argument that the calculation of our operating self-sufficiency must be different from that of a bank, and that we must have an element where we have the financial profitability as one aspect. It could be about maybe 85%, just for argument's sake, and then the other 15% is covered by a creative way to how do you monetize, how do you make a model to monetize social impact and environmental impact to cover that 15%. And then the argument would be that that 15% will always have to be covered by philanthropic. You sell it to the philanthropic side of the fund. That there are people who are willing to give you money that pays for that. And that is the only way you can then claim, rightly so, that then you are operationally self-sufficient. But not to say that you will deploy all your money, get all the interest and cover all your costs, just like a bank does. Because you always be operating on the edge that you just takes one loan to go bad, and the whole model comes crumbling down. And so for me, I think, and why I think it is possible to raise that kind of argument and those kinds of funds is that if you think about the full cycle again, the high net worth individuals also must be told, and we must tell that story to them, that for you to sustain that wealth of yours, you also need to get to a point where you alleviate the extreme poverty. Because, I'll tell you another saying from my country. We had one of our interesting officials make a statement. He said that in Uganda, like in many places I would say, the poor are not sleeping at night because they are hungry, and the rich are not sleeping because the poor are awake, right? And so sustaining the wealth of that rich class will be enhanced by them knowing that they need a little more equitable distribution of wealth across the globe. Professor Yunus talks about wealth concentration as a key risk to the capitalism model. So that is where we need to think about monetizing our social impact and environmental impact to add to the economic impact that we are making through our clients. Thank you.